Good afternoon. I'm most honored to welcome all of you and offer a few opening remarks at this meeting dedicated to the culture of encounter, an imperative for a divided world. I give a special welcome and word of gratitude to our distinguished speakers. Thank you to everyone present here, professors, esteemed professionals, journalists, and friends. Through the COVID-19 pandemic, Pope Francis has powerfully advocated for a culture of encounter to help bridge the divisions that increasingly plague our world. Only when we fully recognize our shared humanity and engage one another with humility, generosity, realism, and passions, from the local to the international level, will we be able to address global challenges together. In St. Peter's Square on March 27 at 6 p.m., before adoring the Blessed Sacrament and giving his blessing Urbi et Orbi, Pope Francis said, "We have realized that we are on the same boat, all of us fragile and disoriented, but at the same time important and needed. All of us called to row together, each of us in need of comforting the other. We are all of us on this boat." The boat is still in the storm. The ongoing Russian war against Ukraine underscores the importance of a culture of encounter as the most appropriate and legitimate means of addressing international conflicts. This war is a vivid example of the absence of a culture of encounter at the international level. Last October, before the first edition of the Rome Conference on the Culture of Encounter, Pope Francis sent a letter to Georgetown University and La Civiltà Cattolica, the two institutions that organize the conference. He wrote, "I am very happy about this initiative, which involves two venerable institutions of the Society of Jesus, with a history that goes back to 1789 for the university and 1850 for the Review. Today, these institutions have come together here to consider the future of our humanity." And then he added, "I thank you then for your efforts to reflect on crucial issues for our world. Through your lectures, articles, and joint initiatives, you are helping so many others to become adepts and artisans of a culture that fosters mutual understanding." That was truly a beautiful message that reinforced what we are doing together and gives it a very authoritative endorsement. A special thanks today to President De Gioia for believing in this project and committing to it from the beginning. I'm also very grateful for the collaboration of Tom Bancroft, Vice President for Global Engagement of Georgetown University, who is here with us today. Francis appreciates the collaboration between Georgetown University and La Civiltà Cattolica as Jesuit institutions of ancient foundation that together look to the future. Georgetown University is the oldest Catholic university and largest Jesuit university in the United States, founded in 1789 by Archbishop John Carroll. Georgetown today is a major student-centered international research university offering programs in Washington, D.C., Doha, Qatar, and around the world. La Civiltà Cattolica is a bi-monthly journal founded in 1850 by Pope Pius IX. It's the only journal overseen by the Secretariat of State of the Holy See, and it's among the oldest periodicals in the world. Since 2017, it has appeared in Italian, English, Spanish, French, Chinese, Korean, Russian, and Japanese. Pope Francis' words invite us to make history. This is a wonderful challenge for all of us. And this is also why we are here today, when the culture of encounter is an imperative for a divided world. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tom Banchoff. I serve as Vice President for Global Engagement at Georgetown University and also as Director of our Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. And it's really wonderful to be with you here at Villa Malta for our conference on the culture of encounter, an imperative for a divided world. I first want to thank Father Spadaro for his words of welcome. As you mentioned, we really have already, just over the past few years, developed a very deep and fruitful collaboration between our institutions, for which I'm very grateful. And on behalf of our president and our entire Georgetown community, I want to emphasize how delighted we are to be with you here again in Rome for the second conference on this critically important topic of the culture of encounter. Now, it may seem incongruous to be addressing this issue, the culture of encounter, at a time of such war and division. But as Pope Francis reminds us, the existence of violence and confrontation in Ukraine and around the world, and not just internationally, but also within and across our societies, is a reason, even a call, to us to do much more, to explore what is possible, what can be done at this critical historical moment, coming out of the pandemic, to foster a peaceful encounter that recognizes but also bridges differences for the common good within our religious communities, within our nations, and across our interdependent global agenda. So we have a lot to discuss today and tomorrow. We're especially grateful that Archbishop Gallagher will share his reflections in a keynote this afternoon, and that tomorrow we'll be joined by Father Arturo Sosa. We also have several panels that will explore the idea and practice of the culture of encounter across three areas: global governance, interfaith collaboration, and digital connectivity. If you'll allow me just a few more words about the context for our gathering. The Culture of Encounter and the Global Agenda Project, which we announced here in this room last November, is an innovative collaboration between Georgetown's Berkeley Center and three Vatican dicasteries for integral human development, culture and education, and interreligious dialogue. The project brings together some 30 scholars and practitioners from around the world across 6 continents to explore the idea and practice of the culture of encounter from different disciplinary and local and national and other points of view. Our goal is to really have a truly global and inclusive conversation about a critical idea, perhaps an underdeveloped idea, and its implications. Just to begin a process that's already underway, to extend a process that will itself extend well beyond this conference, keeping in mind what Pope Francis calls, quote, the priority of initiating processes. In Evangelii Gaudium, back in 2013, he wrote about the necessity of giving priority to actions which generate new processes in society and engage other persons and groups who can develop them to the point where they bear fruit in significant historical events. Without anxiety, he writes, but with clear convictions and tenacity. In that apostolic exhortation, which set out, as we know, the themes of his papacy, he encourages us to develop a culture of encounter marked by humility, generosity, realism, and patience. A call that he reiterated, of course, in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, in the heart of the pandemic, a call that resonates today as an imperative in our divided world. So some 20 or so of the participants in the project have made it to Rome to bring this process forward with all of you, now in this public setting as well, braving COVID restrictions and visa regulations. And you'll be hearing from many of them on panels this afternoon and tomorrow. In closing, I want to thank all of the project participants and to thank all of you here gathered today for being with us this afternoon. I'd also like to recognize the GHR Foundation for its generous support for the project and for this conference, and recognize Deborah Tonelli, the Georgetown representative here in Rome, already known to many here in the room for her expert hand in organizing our gathering, along with my Georgetown colleagues Ruth Gopin and Mary Gordon, who've also made the trip from Washington, D.C. So again, welcome, and with that, let's get started with our first panel on global governance and the culture of encounter. Please join me in welcoming my colleague Jose Casanova and our other panelists to launch the conversation.
I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to have this conversation with our distinguished panelists, and I mean it. Let me introduce them first before I raise a general question, and then we'll have a conversation for about, I guess, 40 minutes before we open the conversation also to the floor to all of you. To my right, Emily Welty, who is an associate professor and the director of Peace and Justice Studies at Pace University in New York City. She also serves as vice moderator of the World Council of Churches and the main representative to the United Nations for the International Peace Research Association. Next is Alessio Pecorario. Dr. Alessio Pecorario is the coordinator of the Security Task Force of the Vatican COVID-19 Commission. Pecorario is also a senior official of the Vatican's Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development. Previously, he was a legal advisor of the Vatican's Financial Intelligence Authority, the European Center for Law and Justice, and the European Commission for Democracy through Law and the Council of Europe. And further from me, but very close to my heart, is my very good friend, Giulia Murao Permoser, who is a postdoctoral research fellow of political science at the University of Innsbruck, my own alma mater, where her research focuses on the relationship between migration, religion, liberalism, and the European Union. Her research has appeared in several journals, among them the European Journal of Migration and Law, Religion, State and Society, the Journal of European Public Policy. Giulia is also originally from Brazil, so she knows the Brazilian situation, Latin American situation also very well. So we will talk about peace and justice, COVID and health and communications and migration. Those are some of the global challenges that we are facing. And precisely we see that we are not responding very, very effectively, efficiently to them. So let me begin with a very general question, and each of the panelists will have the opportunity to give a 5-6 minutes answer, and then we'll have a conversation among ourselves. So let me offer a very, very open general question to them. So the Russian assault on Ukraine underscores the futility of war and the necessity of mutual recognition and respect as a foundation for world politics. So my question is, how is Pope Francis' idea of a culture of encounter relevant at a time of war and global pandemic? And on the basis of your own work, the kind of work you are doing in your institutions, how might the Catholic Church and other religious communities work with states and secular partners to advance global governance oriented to the common good and more inclusive of diverse perspectives? So, Emily, please.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here with you all and to think publicly about these kinds of issues. I think when I think about global governance, I want to trouble the waters a little bit because I think it's very easy for that to feel like a very big and grandiose concept. In fact, I think it is used as a gatekeeping concept sometimes to keep ordinary people from feeling part of things. So I also am trained as a religious ethnographer, so I think about things in the micro moments. And when I think about the conflict in Ukraine, I think it's easy to make that a very distant conflict. But actually there are people in all of our communities that have different kinds of points of intersection. So I was thinking from my context in New York City, suddenly my dentist has Ukrainian flags hanging in the waiting room. And the Russian tea room very near my university has taped over the word Russia, and now it's a Ukrainian flag. And these might seem like very micro moments, but I think they actually tell us interesting things about the way that ordinary people are interacting with something that maybe seems like a very distant concept. Some of them are Russian and are signaling support for Ukraine. Some of them are Ukrainian and don't want to be mistaken for being Russian, so they're really signaling where they stand. Others are making a business decision and are very nervous about a boycott of anything that is associated with Russia, and so are trying to signal being something separate from that. And I raise those moments because I think it's actually very important for us to think about the role of individual people, and that when we think about global governance, what we're actually talking about is all of us. It's not something that happens only in regional security arrangements with NATO, or only at the United Nations, or only at the most rarefied international level. It's actually something that involves ordinary people, the suffering of ordinary people, and how we make our way together. So in the context of my work with the World Council of Churches, one of the ways we've tried to operationalize this is through thinking of our work in terms of what we have called a pilgrimage of justice and peace. And that means that while we're still carrying on the ordinary committee work of World Council of Churches, we've really prioritized going to places where people are suffering or where there has been conflict, and taking very seriously accompaniment. And when I think about how we as WCC are in conversation with these kinds of culture of encounter, that's really what I'm thinking about. How can we think about fellowship? How can we think about, WCC uses the language touching the wounds of people who are suffering, but also naming this sort of transformation. So also finding joy and resilience and not only concentrating on the trauma or the worst moments. So I think when we then translate that back into global governance, the other point of contact that really comes up for me is in the context of anti-nuclear work. So the World Council of Churches has been very involved since our foundation in the work to abolish nuclear weapons. So we've been a partner of the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons and very involved in the non-proliferation treaties, the negotiation of the Treaty on the Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, and other kinds of sort of faith-based approaches. So I think there is a way also to translate that work that takes place at the local level back into these governance structures. And for us, that has really looked like hearing the voices of people who have been the victims of nuclear testing and nuclear weapons use. And that really changes these lofty ideas around nuclear deterrence when you're talking to people whose lives have been affected. So I think that has fed the witness and our kind of motivation to engage then in these global structures.
Thank you, Emily. Alessio.
Thanks for the questions. I think that I would like to start by quoting the Pope at the Regina Coeli of last May 1st, when he said that the war in Ukraine is a macabre regression of humanity. To me, what actually also scares me a lot is the number of intervals between major international crises that we are living in our times. Just to remind the dramatic sequence of the financial crisis and economic recession 2007 and 2008, then the pandemics, now the war in Ukraine, which is a war in Europe. And so I think that this is very, very important too. And I'm asking to myself, what's new in the contemporary ruptures of the international order? Because even before the last few decades, the world have lived moments when we felt that we were about to collapse. The most powerful example normally is the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1972. So what's new then? I think that first of all is the highly globalized dimension of this crisis. No countries, no sector of economy, no category of society is spared from this crisis. And then the sudden definitive existential threat that we feel, no, to the life on Earth. So for us who read the social facts, I think the majority today, through the lenses of Catholic social teaching, we know that this is part of one single crisis, the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, as the Pope teaches us. And embracing the culture of encounter is the only possible systemic response that we can provide to call for bold and broad change, I think. Unfortunately, to come to my topic, new technologies have played a particularly salient role in the erosion of trust, which is the ingredient that collects all these crises that I mentioned. And this is widely known, no? Through widespread manipulation of social and traditional media, fake news, but also deepening the social injustice, the so-called digital divide. According to the Telecommunication Union, already yet in 2019, almost half of the world was not provided with a connection to internet. So this is already a matter of major injustice. But we can go on and continue with the militarization of the cyberspace, the IT competence, and that marked, let's say, an arms race even before the war in Ukraine. What would be done, so, at the Vatican COVID-19 Commission to face this situation and to, let's say, bring integral human development in the new tech? How can we foster a culture of encounter in the digital age? Technological developments we have, let's say, started to notice are seldom accompanied by ethical and moral reflection. And voluntary or not risk governing human activity rather than serving it. So without a comprehensive and moral and ethical framework, rapid technological advancement risk aggravating inequalities and leaving the most marginalized behind. On the one hand, a far-reaching moral vision could direct these technologies toward minimizing harm and serving integral human development. So, at the Vatican COVID-19 Commission, a new technology for peace and integral human development working group was established, whose aim is to bring together experts and practitioners from varying contexts in dialogue to imagine creative solutions to complex technology-related problems. And the working group encompasses many specialists from the most relevant new technologies who are working with the theologians and the Vatican authorities with the aim of increasing awareness within the Church of the challenges and opportunities posed by these new dynamics, and reciprocally inspiring experts and political leaders to promote the common good in the digital age at the heart of the global governance. So first of all, I would say a first level of horizontal collaboration between science and religion and reason and faith that is more and more outside the traditional Western society, thanks also to our colleagues from the Dicastery for Interreligious Dialogue, but also an horizontal, let's say, connection, as Emily was saying, that try to empower the people and to let them feel that we are all part of the global governance system. So, for example, the examples of non-violence or peace building and let's say new texts, applied to peace-building movements on the ground are countless. We try to listen to these people and try, using the advantage of the fact that the ODC is a state as well, to put this at the global governance as models. I think that in conclusion, for my presentation, what I can say that is utilizing the moral imagination to develop theoretical uses of new technologies that serve the common good is greatly needed in our time of history. In the case of new technologies, the Church can first, as I was saying, develop position on the ethics, on the uses of new technologies, drawing on the Catholic social teaching. It then can present local and global wisdom to internal fora and campaign for concrete action. It can facilitate connections between various actors across the world and can host discussion among them. Then, upon further reflection on the efficacy of its practice, always according to the guidelines of the True Encounter and Integral Human Development, it can change its position based on global developments. In this way, a culture of encounter is constantly fostered, and new technologies may eventually be collaboratively and ethically grounded. It's vital to remember that the process of bringing together these experts and practitioners is itself an example of encounter. And even if they don't come to an understanding or to a consensus, the process itself fosters this culture and increases the reservoir of trust among actors. The difficulties inherent in the process show the real work to be done.
Thank you. Julia.
Oh, yeah. Thank you very much, Jose. Thank you all. Very glad to be here and be able to speak to you today. I want to speak to you today about the culture of encounter in connection with the topic of migration and international migration flows, which is my area of expertise. I believe that large-scale migration pressures are one of the most daunting challenges facing our societies today. And there are many causes for that, which Pope Francis points out in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, that are interconnected. The main one being, of course, the enormous disparity in wealth and life chances between different regions of the world, but also climate disasters, and violence and war and conflict and public persecution, political persecution. In that context, we are faced with increasing pressures, migratory pressures, that are not likely to go away, but rather to increase in the future. And here, there's a connection to the war in Ukraine that we can see. Of course, the war in Ukraine has generated an unprecedented number of refugees towards Western Europe, or if not unprecedented, but in the modern era, a very large number of refugees. We now have 6 million Ukrainians displaced throughout the world, 5 million of which in Europe. The response to this flow of refugees has also been an unprecedented one in terms of the degree of solidarity that has been shown towards the refugees coming from Ukraine. European Union countries have, for the first time, triggered the use of the Temporary Protection Directive, a legal mechanism that existed in the books in the European Union, but had never been activated before, and which grants to those fleeing the conflict in Ukraine immediate access to the labor market, freedom of movement within the European Union, and immediate access to protection, and many other benefits, which generally are only given to those who are recognized refugees after a long period of waiting for their claims to be recognized under situations that are often precarious in terms of rights and vulnerabilities. However, so we see here an example, really, of acting in a humane way towards those who are our neighbors and who are in need, that really reflects the ideas of Pope Francis with the culture of encounter. However, this response is also in many ways a very selective one. The treatment granted to those fleeing Ukraine is not the same granted to many others fleeing similar violent situations and disasters. The Mediterranean, not far from here, remains the deadliest migratory route in the whole world. And the same countries that have been so solidary with the neighbors from the East in triggering this directive are applying externalized forms of border control in the Mediterranean that create also violence and make the implementation of human rights commitments more difficult and less accountable. So I believe we need to learn from the response given towards the crisis in the Ukraine and use it as an opportunity to seek to advocate for such more humane responses to global crises on a global level. And we have the opportunity to do so. There are attempts to generate such a global governance of migratory flows. We have seen with the UN Global Compact on Migration one such attempt. Religious communities have always played an incredibly important role, both in the grassroots accompaniment, welcoming, and caring for migrants and those in need, as well as in the global governance of migration. I would like to point out here the really important work being done by the Jesuit Refugee Service, for example, or by the Ecumenical Churches Commission for Migrants in Europe. And there are so many more that have become very important global players and advocates for the human rights of migrants. So it is the moment, I believe, to use this grassroots experience and this public role of religious communities as also those who influence leaders worldwide to make the message that Pope Francis has put forward in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti with his notion of the culture of encounter to generate a more humane and fraternal migration and refugee regime in the world towards those neighbors who are close physically to us, but also towards those who are not so close, but who are nevertheless human beings like us all.
Thank you, Julia. Let me try to bring some of the things you've said together. My own experience in these pilgrimage with other religious leaders to Ukraine was precisely the experience of the importance of the culture of the encounter. There were 20 of us we have never met before, and this itself was for each of us an extremely enriching experience. Each of us is committed to similar principles of peace and justice, of being witness, of accompanying, and yet we came from very different traditions, very different Christian traditions, different Jewish traditions, different Muslim traditions. And we encountered each other precisely at this trip, and then there we encountered the different religious communities in Ukraine and also ordinary people that were suffering. We experienced every religious community we visited, every church, every mosque, every synagogue had served as a shelter for refugees, for the homeless, for those who have lost their homes, and also they were simply serving as places to help them to distribute humanitarian aid. They were serving as networks, transnational networks, through which the humanitarian aid was flowing. And again, each of them was helping everybody as human beings. They were not discriminating Christians, Muslims, Jews. Each of them were simply serving all in need, let's say, in Ukraine. So this in itself was really a unique experience. The question is, again, you say global governance is precisely at this local level, but let's try to think how we can scale up this experience of the culture of the encounter into structures of global governance. I think the problem is precisely how do we link these experiences, these practices of religious communities, of people, NGOs, etc., with the international system, with the world capitalist system, let's call it the Davos system, so that somehow there is a linkage. I had my notes, they are left in the luggage, so I don't know the specific paragraph of Fratelli Tutti in which Pope Francis say, if we think that we only need to just simply do a little better the things we've been doing, reform the system just a little, we are simply kidding ourselves. I'm paraphrasing. We are simply not taking it seriously. It's a very serious crisis, and we see now for 20 years each of these global challenges that neither the international system nor the global system of capitalism is able, they've proven they are unable to address them. On the other hand, the global governance that we are talking about is not there to substitute, because we cannot think of an alternative global governance to those structures. But how do we create structures, institutionalize these structures at the local level, transnational, of civil society, in which secular NGOs and religious communities that can have a voice and a function in addition to the international system of states and to the is the economic system, if you wish. So I want to somehow urge you to think from your own experiences and how. I mean, we know that we need to think boldly. We need to think not in terms of simply tweaking things, but really of thinking big, because otherwise we're in bad shape. So let's see how can we do it. I know it's a tough question. I have no answer, but I want you to help me to find the answer. So.
Yeah, when I think about that question, one of the translations of that question that I think about is, what do religious organizations who have this voice at the UN do with it, rather than just acting as though we are ordinary NGOs? So World Council of Churches has been an ECOSOC accredited organization since the founding of the UN. And so asking, like, what are we doing here actually? Are we here to pretend that to be states? Are we here to be diplomats? What do we do with that on a practical level? And I think one of the things that has struck me over time is the fact that religious people have the grassroots connections to be able to sponsor a delegation from Colombia to come directly and meet with people at the UN and provide that sort of ladder between local and international levels. So I think this accompaniment between a grassroots level and an international level feels important. But to do that, I think religious organizations and institutions have to think about who are we as faith-based organizations? Again, to think about this in terms of this nuclear disarmament work, it is different to say nuclear weapons are a sin than it is to say nuclear weapons are a really terrible, dangerous idea. Like, that moral language actually means something. And so I think I come to this thinking religious people have to be willing to stand in the sense of being religious and bring that work in meaningful ways to this international system. And I think that churches and other institutional religious expressions have been in a good situation to do that. But sometimes there's a lot of pressure to pretend to be a diplomat or pretend to be a secular organization. And so maintaining that sense of who we are as people of faith feels critical and challenging all the time.
As we move there in Kiev to pray together, one of the things that came again and again is the power of prayer, that we do need. We have to believe in the power of prayer because it moves people in different ways to do some things that otherwise they are not done. So I want to continue in this vein and how can this power of prayer, this motivation that religious communities bring, help in thinking creatively to new practices that can become institutionalized and can have some fruits.
Well, I think that a good model is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons that Emily also was mentioning. And I have to speak as a Vatican official. To me, that model works because the Vatican can display the real convening power. No? The real power of the Vatican is bringing, in a transparent way, the supreme good of peace at the heart of global governance. And the fact that this is built up with the collaboration of so many international NGOs, we collaborate a lot with ICANN as well, at the same time convenes states and the majority of states and the academics, but also more and more we see interested people from the private sector. So this is something that is unique for the Vatican. Listening and start to reflect and propose and create a safe space, a fertile soil where the others can grow, it's the first thing. Then we have also to translate into practice by reducing the gap. Because, for example, when it comes to nuclear weapons, when we say the vast majority of states, the overwhelming international community don't want nuclear weapons, this is true. But people has also have to, because we can say also this because if we take the public opinion in the states with nuclear weapons, we are for sure, we know that people would agree with us. But we have to generate this awareness. So we have to reduce the gap in terms of knowledge, because truth is, unfortunately, that Catholic social doctrine evolution on nuclear disarmament is not known at parish level very often. No? So we have this potential change, we have to deploy.
Julie.
Yes, I think this is really the crucial question. How do we manage to implement this and bring it to another level? And what I see in my research on the role of churches and religious actors in the migration policy field, but also other humanitarian actors, is that they're really engaged in transformative action on the ground, and many times stepping in when the state fails to do so. But they're also afflicted by the fear of being somehow used, becoming part of a system where by acting in that humanitarian way and filling in the gaps of the states, the state might not be in its responsibility. So I think the solution is really to build bridges and create coalitions of actors between different types of actors. Civil society has to work together with political actors, with state actors. Religious leaders have to come together to be able to institutionalize a different type of response.
One of the experiences also of us going to Kiev was crossing borders, the need to cross borders and build bridges across borders. Because both the pandemic taught us the knee reaction of every country was to close the borders and to try to solve the crisis separately, right? I was stuck in Prague when it happened. I couldn't move because every country in Europe had closed its borders. So if Europe, the first reaction of Europe is to close its borders. And we see how a war is ultimately over national questions of national security. And the international system is organized to think in terms of national security. And the question is, we have to think in terms of global structures that address global challenges. So in this respect, also a unique resource of most religious communities that they can work across borders, that they are transnational structures. And so not to necessarily, so the question is not to create new institutional structures that are political competing with, but to be a force that basically demands something beyond purely the international system of states that can only think in terms of national security ultimately. So I think that it is this aspect of the transnational character of most religious communities, and today through migration. Before, most religions had been territorialized in continents, but today the experience of all religions in the world is that they become through migration, through globalization, global transnational religious communities. And I think that we have to use this unique opportunity precisely to think in those terms. Let me then open the floor for questions to our panelists. So please, we still have, I think, half an hour. So please, I see two questions there. Please, Joe, please. Father, ciao.
One observation about the reaction to the flow of refugees, because I think we need to understand the difference. I was thinking that if Kiev had not been attacked on the morning of February 24th, we would not have what we have now. A very strong sense of unity in the European Union, a much stronger sense of unity, and a reinforcement of an organization as NATO, so much that 2 more countries are applying to join. So I think that the difference there is because millions, hundreds of millions of Western Europeans perceived the Russian attack at 5 in the morning on February 24th as an existential threat. We all felt and feel, I feel, threatened by this gigantic military complex under the orders of the man that commands the Russian Federation, autocratically, etc., etc. So, would you agree that there is a difference? So that when so I try to talk not as a Christian, not as a Catholic priest, a Jesuit. I try to talk to understand what is happening. So why are the migrants from Ukraine closer to millions of families across Europe? Because millions of families across Europe feel truly that it could happen to them, to us, one day. And that makes a huge difference. So, and secondly, another observation is about the borders. Well, I think that the Russians, and you know that the popularity of the war is growing, still growing in Russia. I saw it yesterday or 2 days ago here on Italian television, the presence of a Russian journalist that reacted to the observation of the, how do you call it, the director of the program, "We are crying for Ukraine." And that Russian journalist said something to that, in that sense, well, if you cry, we do not cry, and if you want to cry, be ready, because we will have much more to cry about in the near future, which is a clear menace. And Russians, many in Russia, intellectuals, journalists, Sokolov or Solovyov, etc., they talk a very menacing language. So my question is, what shall we do? Shall we, again, of course, I am totally 200% in favor of the culture of encounter, but in a time like this, is it not so that we need something more? Is it so that we can tolerate that an independent sovereign country be pushed aside by a neighbor that has the military power to do so? So what to do? How to respond? Thank you very much for this wonderful initiative.
If I may, obviously this is I will give you the opportunity to respond. On the one hand, everything you said is perhaps right. On the other hand, the question is, what are the consequences of responding like that? If we think of this as a Kairos moment that we must use to precisely reform the global system, and that we don't fall into a new bipolar war of the democratic West against the rest, because this will be a terrible consequence if this is the consequence of responding to clearly the fundamental crisis created by, let's say, the country that chairs the National Security Council of the United Nations. Yes, this is precisely because it is such a unique moment, and then uses nuclear blackmail. Precisely because of that, we cannot simply respond as a front against. We have to reopen the conversation about how we can create a global system where such events cannot happen, where superpowers cannot do that. So all superpowers, not only Russia. So, but please.
Yes, I think this is a crucial comment. I agree fully with what you said, Jose, and I also agree that we must still be able to call out an aggression when it happens, and an abuse of power when it happens, of course. The question is really how to respond to it in a way that does not reinforce then the division, but really tries to tread a path towards peace, right? Concerning the question about refugees, I think it is an absolutely natural, understandable reaction that we all share, that if the dangers close to home, if we identify with the people who are suffering, it is easiest to show solidarity and to feel the pain and the suffering of our neighbors. This is absolutely true, and in fact, if we look at the numbers, 39% of all refugees worldwide are hosted in 5 countries. Yeah. And these countries are Turkey, Colombia, because of the Venezuelan refugees, Uganda, Pakistan, and Germany. So only one of the countries in this list is a very rich country. And when we think about global governance, what we need to think of is how to deal with this situation in a way that does not generate further inequalities, disparities of wealth and life chances when we have such small number of countries shouldering the responsibility for providing protection and life, minimal life standards to a large number of people. So that's in this sense my comments. Not to say that the display of solidarity and the feelings that Europeans, Western Europeans and Eastern Europeans have towards the neighbors from Ukraine is wrong in any way.
Okay, would you like to add something?
I would like just to say that what to do. Well, I wish to have the response. What I can see from my perspective, because I come from the world of disarmament, is what we shouldn't do. And in this sense, for example, filling even more the war with militarization and with weapons, basically, is not the response, the right response, honestly. If we take the data from CIPRI, we know that military expenditure in 2021 exceeds, for the first time in history, the number of 2 trillion. So that was before the war in Ukraine. And now it will go even up. So the first thing, I think that it's a Kairos moment, as you were saying, and we should position ourselves in a position, for example, when it comes to security, to think not only, you were mentioning the difference between national and global security, but also in the position of integral security. I came from Syria, for example, where I can see that the country is 95% insecure from a military point of view in security, but actually, just take the example of sanctions. We are still in an economy of war, which is the preparation of the military war. The sanctions topic is big, is huge. It's impeding to the humanitarian people to make their job. And this is targeting the people, not the regime. So this is the occasion that we have, this is the moment to reflect why the global system doesn't work. And the Ukraine case can only be worse, because if we are going to do the same in Ukraine, that will have repercussion on the global economy already proved by the COVID. So I think that what we shouldn't do is remain in this economy of war, because the consequence is war.
Do you want me to say?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think the thing I would add to that is I hear you, Jose, continuing to say like this more radical rethinking of global governance. And the thing I would add to this is I think it's a moment to also think very carefully about the Security Council and particularly the veto of the Permanent Five and what that really means, as well as NATO, which is a nuclear arms sharing, it's a nuclear umbrella as well. And so when we look at really investing in this collective security, I think this isn't just a political calculation. It's also, for us as people of faith, should be a faith-based calculation. What does it mean that some lives are worthy of being protected with nuclear weapons and others aren't? What does it mean that some hands are safe hands for nuclear weapons and other ones aren't? Those questions should trouble our conscience, I think, and should really invite us into asking, do we think that national sovereignty and these national allegiances are more important than our collective security? For me as a person of faith, I think that that is a form of idolatry, to think that your nation state holds your allegiance more than humanity. And I think it is a moment to really dig deeper into these structures and not just say, well, that's what we have, so that's what we're sticking with. Crisis invites us into these Kairos moments, as many of us have said.
Okay, please, in the back, there is.
Claudio Betti, I'm the director of Australian Catholic University campus here in Rome. And I think it's the proper moment to talk about the culture of encounter. I think that, and the question of the father who just spoke before me also questions me. I think that when we ask ourselves what we should do, the least thing that comes to my mind is that we should shake away the ordinary paradigm that we're used to think with. It is clear that the paradigms we've worked until now do not work. This is something that it's crucial to understand, and it is the basis of any reflection of what it means to live a culture of encounter. it is clear that the answer we are giving now to a crisis is not the right answer. It needs different answers. It needs to be based on different cultural background. Now, I am not able to go into the political aspects, although I would like to, but I think that I would not be so popular, at least in Italy. But I can say what it means, for example, for religious organizations. I think that all of you said it very clearly, and you, Jose, said it. We have to move from reform to prophecy. There is the desperate need to change the way we deal with reality, especially if we are religious people who believers, men and women of faith. We need to be prophetic. In a world where prophecy does not exist, like it is written in the scripture, it was a time where prophecy was scarce, we hear in the Bible. Well, in a world where prophecy is scarce, we need to be prophets. And this is true for religious leaders, first of all for religious leaders. Apparently, where very few are at this moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. But let me counter with, I've been studying Ukraine for 30 years. And I've been following the divergence, three societies that were very similar when it all started, the fall of the Soviet Union, Belarus, Ukraine, Russia. And they've diverged. The divergence happens in Ukraine, and the war today is about which type of model of society, both at the global level, and the question here is not the defense of nationalism, it's the defense of a form of life that allows to live freely. Ukraine is today the most religiously pluralistic country in Europe, the most tolerant, where all the Christian religions, all of them, Protestants, Orthodox, Catholic, Greek Catholics, and Jews and Muslims, live in a way that they don't do in any other European society. And this has to do with a choice they've made of the kind of society. And this is also a consequence of the war. As we know, the Russian Orthodox claim this is our territory and would prefer not to have there neither the Greek Catholic Church nor the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, and would like to have also a conflict with the West, the decadent, secularist West. So we have to, one of our tasks is not only be prophets and think of what is like, but we have to be informed. What to do? We need truth, information, the facts are crucial. And each context is different. So again, I fully agree with what you are saying, but we have to be prophets for specific places and for a specific context also. And so precisely this conflict forces us to rethink many, many things. There are still, as believers, of course, we may say that political systems don't matter, but they do matter. Which kind of political system we have matters also for religion, for the possibility of having even freedom of religion. So let's take this also seriously into account. Please.
Assalamu alaikum. I will speak Arabic and my interpret. أشكركم طبعا على هذا الحوار المثير للجاذبية والإعجاب، وأود أن أبدأ من حيث ذكرت جوليا حين تحدثت عن أن لدينا لاجئين من مناطق مختلفة. الحقيقة أنا شايف أنه أنا لا أمانع أن نركز على قضية اللاجئين الأوكران في ظل الموقف الروسي الأوكراني الصعب، ولكن أيضا علينا أن نوسع النظرة لننظر إلى العديد من اللاجئين حول العالم، وأتحدث تحديدا عن مشكلة أفغانستان واللاجئين من أفغانستان الذين يعانون من أزمة كبرى. ونحن في مجلس حكماء المسلمين وفي لجنة الأخوة الإنسانية نهتم كثيرا بهذا الأمر، خاصة في ظل الموقف المعقد في أمريكا وأوروبا بعد أحداث أفغانستان الأخيرة وخروج آلاف من اللاجئين وصلوا إلى عدة عواصم أوروبية وإلى أمريكا، وهم يعانون من مشكلة الانعزال والتردد في الاندماج في المجتمعات الغربية التي يعيشون فيها خوفا على هويتهم الإسلامية. وكذلك في نفس الوقت خوف المجتمعات الغربية التي يعيشون فيها من هؤلاء اللاجئين والنظر إليهم على أنهم قنبلة موقوتة، يعني أتوا من مجتمعات يهددها الإرهاب وثقافة التطرف منتشرة فيها، وبالتالي يخافون من التعامل معهم ويتم عزلهم عن المجتمعات التي يعيشون فيها. فالحقيقة أنا أود أن أستغل هذه الفرصة لأسمع منكم ما هي رؤيتكم لهذا الأمر، كيف يمكن أن تتشارك المؤسسات والمنظمات، ونحن نحاول مع جورج تاون من خلال خبراتها أن نتحدث في مجموعة من المحاور أو التحديات التي تواجه العالم. أعتقد أننا نحتاج أيضا إلى عولمة هذه القضية، كيف يمكن أن تلعب مؤسسات الدينية ومنظمات المجتمع المدني دورا على الأرض في معالجة هذه العزلة أو التردد، كما أسميه التردد بين العزلة والاندماج لهؤلاء اللاجئين المنتشرين حول العالم. شكرا.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank all the panelists and all the participants for this wonderful discussion. I would like to start from the point mentioned by Julia about that we have to show the same degree of solidarity towards other refugees in different parts of the world, like the Mediterranean and other parts of the world. And I don't mind that we should pay more attention to the refugees coming from Ukraine, but I think it's imperative also to widen the circle of our attention to the refugees coming and fleeing other parts of the world, like the Afghan refugees. We at the Muslim Council of Elders and the Higher Committee of Human Fraternity are much concerned about this, especially after the complicated situation in the United States and Europe, because there are a considerable number of Afghan refugees who fled to these countries, but they are suffering from total isolation and they are hesitant to integrate positively in the host communities because of two factors. The first factor is that they are afraid about their Muslim identity and Islamic identity. And the other factor is that the fact that the host communities are afraid of them because they see them as potential risk or a potential, factor of terrorist attacks. Because, of course, they are coming from a country known for its terrorism and terrorist attack. So what's your perspective and vision on how we benefit from the collaboration between NGOs and religious communities to turn this kind of collaboration and partnership at the global level to highlight this very important and dangerous issue of isolation of the refugees in the host communities? And we have been recently collaborating with Georgetown University, and I'd like to thank them. We would like to benefit from the expertise and experiences of international experts on this area. So how we can globalize this issue of the isolation of refugees? Thank you very much.
Before I give you the opportunity, let me just comment on this experience of this trip to Kiev. There were two Muslim leaders in the delegation. There was somebody many of you know, Imam Yahya Pallavicini, which is the head of Quraysh, the Committee of Islamic Communities here in Italy, and Imam Ibrahim Mudra from the United Kingdom. And we visited two major Muslim centers in Ukraine, which themselves are centers of Muslim refugees. One was the center of Muslim Tatars, who were basically refugees of the annexation of Crimea. Many of them were persecuted because they wanted to continue being Muslims in Crimea, and without allegiance to Russia, they couldn't do it. So you have this basically a center of Muslim refugees from Crimea in Ukraine. The other was the main Islamic center in Kyiv. It's made up of refugees from all the ex-Soviet republics, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and all of them are actually together, living together as Muslims in Kyiv, relatively in good condition. So again, this shows how complex the reality of all of us is. We cannot think anymore in terms of territories, of this is the territory of Islam, this is the territory of Christianity. And we have to think of precisely the fact that we all have become immigrants, global communicants with one another. And this should lead us. And what became very clear for all of us after the experience, we have to go back to our communities. There was archbishop from the Church of England. The responsibility of bringing this experience to our communities to create precisely this kind of global networks of communication, of collaboration. So it is out of the experience of how each of our societies have become centers of migration and centers of encounter of all global religions. Each society today is religiously pluralistic. And out of this experience, we should learn precisely to create structures of communication among the religions throughout the globe. So, please. But I would like to...
Yes, well, yes, thank you very much for this comment. I fully agree, and I think it is crucial to highlight the importance of religious tolerance, religious diversity, both as a source of conflicts that generate refugees and migrants, as well as a source of problems also in the host societies that we need to be aware of and we need to fight against, right? So, and as Jose has mentioned, religious communities are very involved in this fight against religious intolerance, and we need to build on that to institutionalize attitudes of respect and tolerance for all, besides facilitating access for those seeking asylum to actual protection and making it speedy, and the integration has to happen from the very beginning, rather than being something that is expected only to happen at the end of a protracted period of isolation, as is many times the case. Thank you.
Would you like to add something, or we go to... So please, here, and then second. So we have 3 questions. Let's get these 3 questions. Maybe let's gather the 3 questions, and we can have then a response, and then we'll see with additional questions. Please.
Yeah. Christina Lieto Gomez from Australian Institute of Theological Education. So this speaks to the comment that's already been made by the previous 2 comments, and that is there room for asking the question, who's been at the center, who then determines what are the important questions and what are the solutions, and maybe rethinking about decentering and moving to the margins, and asking the voices that haven't been heard to go into the center, allowing them into the center. For example, listening to the wisdom of Indigenous peoples, and especially with Pope Francis's push for integral ecology, and the Indigenous peoples know about this idea of integral ecology, and of course they already know and experience this culture of encounter. Is there room in global governance for asking the question, who has been in the center, and how do we decenter so we allow those voices, those neglected voices, to come into the center?
So think about your answer while we get other questions. No, first we are going to gather the 3 questions. Please.
Thank you very much for this engaging conversation. I'm always wary of one meta-narrative or one story narrative. Maybe to paraphrase this, I come from Rwanda with several wounds, and it's one thing for, let's say, those who killed during the genocide to say they are the ones who perpetrated, but also the survivors to be on the other camp. So how do you bring the narratives together? And why do I ask this question? Is there something to listen to on the Russian side? So that, because then that allows for an encounter, for a conversation. To what extent can we listen to a narrative from Russia and hear their complaints? So I hope this is a sensitive issue, and that's why I paraphrased from Rwanda, so that you understand where I come from. to what extent can we listen to a Russian narrative if we are actually to come to an encounter and for future encounters? Thank you.
Okay, the third one behind.
Thank you very much. I am Lado, that's my name, and I work in Chad, precisely in Jamena, which is of course at the periphery if we take the West to be the center. And I just want to follow up on some of the words used by the two before me. The margins, and then taking the pain to listen to the other's narrative. Well, when I look at, because we are talking about global governance, I heard Emily saying there is something to be fixed in the international system. And I think, again, it is good to pay attention to that aspect of the debate. Because when I look at what is happening in Africa now, people, especially Francophone Africa, they are going after France, taking down French flags and putting up the Russian flags. Because they look at Russia as a counter power to the Western power. And to understand this, one has to look at the historical perspective. It's not actually a matter of embracing France, embracing Russia against France. It is a way of saying we need a counterpower to the West, under which we have suffered for so many decades. It might be a naive approach to a more complex situation, but again, I just want to say maybe the West needs to step back and think about how it has governed the world so far as superpowers. And maybe it will help to have more humane encounters. Thank you.
Well, these are all very, very important questions. But before I let the things, I want you to think also that Ukraine is the periphery of Imperial Russia. And unless you understand this, that it is the colonized periphery of Imperial Russia, that Russia says Ukrainians have no right to exist. They have to be Russians, not Ukrainians. Ukrainians, the name should not exist. The language should not exist. Unless you hear this, and then you should realize that we are dealing with a colonial experience within Europe itself. I want you, because this is what when I listen to the Ukrainians, we want to be Ukrainians. We don't want to be Russians. And of course, if Russians say Ukrainians have no right to exist unless they are Russians, then obviously we cannot simply put in terms of the West. There's something else going on. And actually it was the representative of Kenya in the United Nations that gave the fantastic speech that understood the situation between Russia and Ukraine as a typical post-colonial war. And this is what it is, a post-colonial war. And unless we understand this, we also do not hear what Ukrainians are saying, who they are. Please.
I think I would start with taking up Christina's point around who is the center. I think that is a really important question to hold, to kind of bring to all of this. And actually, to link that to the question around the treatment of refugees, I feel very nervous about the word assimilation because it assumes a norm. And I come from the United States. When assimilation is talked about as this great, wonderful thing of the melting pot, it actually means orienting to a norm that is white, Western, English-speaking, Christian. And I think we need to trouble the waters on that and say, it's not just one norm. There has to be space for this multiplicity of different communities. So I think even thinking about who is the center can redirect our attention on some of these things. In terms of thinking about narratives of loss, it's the unpleasant truth that we actually have to ask. I think the greater wisdom that comes out of trauma literature is that hurt people hurt other people. And unless we are willing to engage with that kind of woundedness, there's nothing more dangerous in some ways than a wounded person who is going to act out their own perceived powerlessness. And so I think, thinking about the Fellowship of the World Council of Churches, we have to contend with the complexity of that fellowship and to take seriously the narratives of everyday people also. I think it's one thing to look at the leader of a country and say, well, how can you possibly be experiencing hurt or loss, like you're the leader of a massive country, but the ordinary perspective of ordinary people. And that is unpleasant. It is unpleasant in societies of perpetrators and survivors to ask about the woundedness of perpetrators. I think that is one of the hardest questions. But it's a question that religious communities can also do because of this sense of holding the pain of a lot of different stories. So yeah, just to take up all 3 and 4 of those really powerful comments, I think this asking who is the center of global governance and why, if that center has misused its power and imposed horrifically over time, of course there is resistance to that center. It should be resisted in that way. And maybe that is what puts us into these moments of reimagining and decolonizing some of the ways that we've seen this.
Oh, no, I do agree, and thanks for the comments. To what extent, I listened the Russian narrative. I think that Emily is right. Of course, the narrative from the power can be different from the narrative of everyday people. And it's important that we pay attention to have this prophetic voice of having the poor, having the marginalized, the victims not only present at the table of discussion of diplomacy, as I was saying before, but also at the center actually. Because another word that is very important, and I'm sure that in the following panels we will hear a lot about that, is synodality. After the encounter comes the fact that we have to work together in shared values. So for doing that, it's important that we intercept the values of the everyday people. I couldn't agree more. Religion can have a very important advantage regarding this because they think in transcendent ways by nature. So the solution that we have to look for are not the solution of the electoral cycle that a country has to respect. It's a solution that is forward-looking solution and is shared also horizontally because religions lives beyond national borders. So this is a very important point of advantage.
Yes, well, I think what the comments here have shown is that the Ukraine is a war and a conflict among so many others that we have in the world. So many of us have live in a country that is plagued by war and conflict or has been. And I'd like to paraphrase or quote Jose Casanova here in responding to your question about listening to Russia, in saying that I think listening and reconciliation is necessary to end the conflict, but it can only happen when there is the acceptance of the right of the other to exist. This is the minimum baseline upon which peace and reconciliation can be achieved. Without the acceptance of the right of the other to exist, it's hard to think of the possibility of any encounter or dialogue.
And the question is, how can we build today already the possibility of reconciliation between Ukraine and Russia? We have to work for it already now. And only the religious communities can do it. They share so much. But right now, it's almost impossible to talk across the borders. In 2015, when the war in Donbass started, we organized a conference for precisely truth and reconciliation between Ukraine and Russia in Kiev, at the School of Diplomacy, and it was based on the millennium celebration of the two first saints of the Kiev church, the two brothers, Boris and Gleb, the brothers that were killed by their brother because they didn't want to take out the sword, and they were taken by the population as the example of Christian, precisely peacemaking. They died. But the Orthodox churches were not willing to celebrate this millennium of these two saints that precisely symbolize the origin of Orthodox Christianity. And Putin said, we cannot celebrate them as saints because were not ready to die for their country. They were ready to let themselves be killed. So yes, we have to create new conditions, and the churches will. The problem is that we hear to the narrative of Russia. The narrative of Russia coming out of the Orthodox Church is not a very Christian narrative. It's a narrative of hate. I'm sorry to say it. And unless we listen to it, it's very difficult. But anyhow, we have two questions here. Please, both of them. Two questions and then.
Okay, thank you very much. It has been very interesting. I'm a diplomat, so I will always say that, supremacy of diplomacy over military means. And I'm not talking about Ukraine only, because there are so many other conflict and war-like situation. I would have hoped that, our discussion today would have been more general than focusing on one particular conflict. I'm not undermining that conflict. We have the Palestinian question for more than 70 years. We have the Myanmar, where it is basically also a religious war between the Muslim and the Buddhist. Having said so, that's what I would have hoped our conversation would have been more general terms. But you are very right. There has to be some political will to engage on both sides. And it has to be a win-win situation, because no side would like to back down, So how we can promote, we by we mean the international community, the non-political one, because the political one is always kind of motivated by their interest. It could be the national interest, it could be the interest of the dictator in power, and unfortunately often that interest is driven by the armament industry. It might sound naive, but I can say it's not, because the profit of armament industry proffers well with more and more conflict ongoing. We all know that. I don't have to spell out. So how we can ensure a win-win situation in this conflict situation, either in Ukraine or elsewhere, because two sides, it's like two children in a war game, nobody will back out, but there has to be some way of a face-saving exit for one party, so there is less civilian loss, because ultimately it's the civilians who pay, either as refugees, migrants, or by simply perishing. So that should be the role of our culture of encounter, to try and find a middle way. And how do we do it? It's a big question, but that should be. Military solution is not the solution. The war should not be won in the battlefield. Thank you.
Please. I think that we have to.
I'm Evelyn from India, Evelyn Montero. I have something very similar to share about what was just spoken now. You see, all the conversation and discussion that we've been having is something concrete, there's no doubt, because we're taking some concrete examples of Ukraine, etc. But deep down, I think we are really facing or going through something which historically has been there in the past, but it's high time that we learn something from the past and do something about it. And that is the power struggle. You find this power struggle practically everywhere, not only in Europe, not only in Ukraine now, but but everywhere, in every area of life, whether it's politics, whether it's economics, whether it's whatever. The whole question is, are we ready to share power? Power with the poor, with the weak, or those who are in power, whether economically, politically, or whatever it is, always want to remain in power. And this is creating a lot of problems even today. And even in the 21st century, we cannot go beyond that. We cannot think beyond that. We still want to hold on to the power. Whether it's rich, or whether it's the upper caste that we have in my country like India, whoever it may be. And this is causing so much problems everywhere, so many problems. And I feel that history has not taught us. We are not ready to learn from what has happened in the past. So, and this whole theme about the culture of encounter, it's so rich and so profound because it is all embracing and it is inclusive. And if we can take this further, of how we can bridge the power gaps, how we can empower the poor, how we can empower the weak, I think if some efforts could be made there, it will be something that we can contribute to the world. This is my small contribution.
Ahmed, you have the last question, please.
Thank you. Listening to, especially, it's not on? Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, Ahmed Alibashic from Sarajevo. Listening and hearing about people who kind of being angry at the West celebrate the rise of Russia, I would suggest that we should, we should remember that saying that goes, pessimists say it cannot get worse. Optimists say, yes, it can. So those people who think what has happened to them is the worst thing that can happen, actually, I am afraid there are worse things that can happen. Yes, we know about the abuses of liberal democracies and so on and so forth. It's not that abuses by Russians are not happening. It's simply that there is no freedom even to discuss them, and we don't hear about them. So let's keep that balance of information and freedoms in mind. As we are pondering and thinking about how to respond, may I suggest that we look back at a conflict 30 years that happened 30 years ago in the Balkans, which in retrospective now looks like an introduction to the current one, except that this one is much bigger, scale is different. But if you look at the justification, at denial of the right to the other to exist, it's his or her identity, and speech or narrative about certain right to Russian world or whatever, it's actual replica. One lesson that we can learn from that is that you cannot appease evil. In our part of the world, ethnic cleansing happened, genocide happened. This is not my story or some other people's story. This is UN tribunals, International Court of Justice, UN Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, some German, some US courts. They have spoken. Unfortunately, there are still people today, actually most people who committed crimes back in early 90s are denying even the basic truth about what happened. And in terms of reconciliation, we are worse off today than we were 15 years ago. So, this is still ongoing conflict, but there is a precedent that can help us understand and probably decide how to react. Thank you. Sorry for being too long.
Unfortunately, we are told by higher authorities that we don't have more time. But I want to end on a point of reflection about the past. France and Germany have been at war for 75 years. 3 major wars. In the midst of World War II, while the war was going on, French Catholics decided we have to begin reconciliation with German Catholics during the war. And this was the vein of Pax Christi, And this was the vein of the European Union that was constructed to end wars in Europe. Again, in the war between Poland and Germany had begun for centuries. It was the Polish bishops that wrote a letter to the German bishops asking for forgiveness, not the German bishops to the Poles. So sometimes, yes, it is precisely the weak that have to be ready to begin the conversation with the powerful, precisely to be able to start a new beginning. And I hope that this is what I hope will happen not only in Ukraine, but also in Burma and in many other places in Palestine and so on.